The greatest spells in D&D can shatter reality itself with their power.
But some just shatter your hopes and dreams.
We are looking at the 5 worst spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Welcome, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
And today we're taking a look at the 5 worst spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Now, full spellcasters in D&D 5e must choose a relatively small arsenal of maybe a few dozen spells from a player's handbook that contains hundreds of different options. This is why it's really important to choose your spells wisely, so you have a good balance of magical powers that will suit you in combat, exploration, and even social situations.
But some players and dungeon masters are pretty optimistic with their views on the spells in D&D and think that there's a place for each and every one. But with so many to choose from, there's sure to be a few that don't measure up.
So we've studied the spellbook, we've asked for your opinions, and we've collected our list of the 5 worst spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
So let's get rolling. So first and foremost, let's clear up a few things about what we mean by the 5 worst spells in D&D.
So when we say worst, we mean, first of all, the spell is significantly less impactful compared to other spells of the same level available to similar class spell lists.
The spell isn't even good at accomplishing what it sets out to do.
Third, the situations where the spell might actually be useful are so rare and niche that most of the time you're better off looking at options which are more flexible and usable in a wider range of circumstances.
Lastly, the spell doesn't fulfill a world-building, narrative, or role-playing purpose in the game.
In other words, we excluded ritual spells or what some might call a DM spell, such as Continual Flame or Magic Aura, from consideration, as these spells really more exist to explain why certain magical effects work the way they do, rather than to be a competitive option amongst the other spells.
We consulted the official errata and the Sage Advice Compendium to make sure that we were up to date on our knowledge on these spells. Finally, we can't account for how things might be different at your table. We're talking about our opinions on how these spells work and why they aren't very good at what they're supposed to do.
Of course, your dungeon master is always the final authority on how the rules work and play, and you have the option to adhere as closely or veer away from the rules as you want to. We're just looking at what's in the books as presented and judging those based on our experiences playing D&D and reading the official 5th edition modules.
The first spell we're going to be looking at today, and the one most widely regarded by our community as one of the worst spells in D&D, is True Strike.
True Strike is a divination cantrip that is available to bards, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards, and it's found on page 284 of your player's handbook. It requires 1 action to cast, as well as your concentration, which makes it fairly unique as one of the few cantrips in the game that does require your concentration.
When you cast True Strike, you point at a target within 30 feet, and on your next turn, you have advantage on an attack against that creature.
So, right off the bat, cantrips are very limited. Most classes only get about 3 to 5 of them, so making this one of your cantrip choices cuts you off from taking much better options like attack spells, mage hand, minor illusion, and other fantastic cantrips.
Also, you can only concentrate on one spell at a time, so wasting that on something like a cantrip that doesn't do very much compared to the other cantrips available seems like a waste of your concentration.
In addition, there are just so many ways to generate advantage on an attack roll in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. With True Strike, you have to set yourself up for the next attack, and the limited range, the 1 action to cast, and the 1 round duration means that you can't even do a lot of creative ways that would generate advantage well in advance of an ambush. You really have to commit to it being the next thing that you do. You can't even combine True Strike with cool abilities like the Eldritch Knight's War Magic class feature or the Sorcerer's Quicken spell, because the spell explicitly says it only works on your first attack on your next turn.
The other problem is this only applies to the one foe that you cast it on.
True Strike can be mechanically worse than simply trying to attack twice across 2 of your turns. There are very few spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that are so critical that they hit or miss that you want to spend your entire action one turn ahead to guarantee, not even guarantee that it's going to hit. So you're going to True Strike to make sure that your first Scorching Ray hits or a melee attack hits when you could have just taken 2 melee attacks across 2 turns. You might have done more damage that way.
If you're looking for a good spell to try out instead, find Familiar, which allows you to summon a familiar, which on its turn can use the help action, granting you advantage on your attack. Works just as well as True Strike, but a little bit better and a little bit more reliable, and doesn't require your concentration or 2 rounds. The second spell that we are looking at today is Witch Bolt.
This is another one that so many of our community members pointed out as a terrible, terrible spell. It's a first level evocation spell available to sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards, and it's found on page 289 of your player's handbook.
With Witch Bolt, you make a ranged spell attack. It requires 1 action to cast, requires your concentration, and you can cast it up to 30 feet.
On a hit, Witch Bolt deals 1d12 lightning damage initially, and then on subsequent rounds, as long as you maintain your concentration and the target stays within 30 feet of you, and you spend your action to do so, you can automatically deal another 1d12 lightning damage to the target. On average, this is only 1 point of damage better than casting Firebolt or an unenhanced Eldritch Blast.
While the initial damage of Witch Bolt does upscale, the subsequent rounds do not, meaning that being able to hit the target with Firebolts every turn is going to give you a lot more damage, especially at higher levels.
Yeah, because by the time you hit 5th level and have 3rd level spell slots, your Firebolt is dealing 2d10 damage. Your Eldritch Blast, 2d10 damage. But Witch Bolt, even when you upcast it using your 3rd level spell slot, that initial damage is pretty nice, 3d12. Not terrible, not a lot.
And there is the benefit of being able to hit automatically every turn, but requiring your concentration and all of those other things that basically you're taking up your entire turn just to use Witch Bolt, when there are lots of other options.
Furthermore, the spell immediately ends if the target walks 30 feet away from you. If it's out of range, it's over. If your concentration is interrupted, it's over. There's far better things to be spending your action and your concentration on than dealing 1d12 damage turn after turn. Witch Bolt is an utter and complete trap of a spell. It's a waste of your spell slot, it's a waste of your memorization or your spells known, and it's a complete waste of your actions on subsequent turns compared to all of your other options.
If you want our advice for a spell to take instead, just cast any cantrip.
Literally any damage-dealing cantrip will show better results than Witch Bolt, especially over time.
And they don't use a spell slot. The third spell we're going to be looking at today is one of my favorites, Find Traps.
Find Traps is a 2nd level divination spell. It's available to clerics, druids, and rangers, and you can find it on page 241 of your player's handbook.
Now, based on the name, Find Traps, what do we think this spell should do?
I'm going to cast the spell down the dangerous hallway, and the spell is going to give me some sort of benefit to help me find where the trap is so the rogue can disable it, right?
Nope. Here's the definition of the spell Find Traps. This spell merely reveals that a trap is present. You don't learn the location of each trap, but you do learn the general nature of the danger posed by a trap you sense.
And furthermore, the spell only reveals the location of mechanical or manufactured traps that were intended to cause harm. It doesn't reveal natural hazards like a weak floor or a wall that might fall over or natural flame jets or even a sewer that has loose valves. It's not going to tell you that. It has to be a intentional trap.
The spell requires you to have line of sight to the trap, meaning that if it's around the corner, you're not going to be able to detect it.
What if the trap is underneath a panel?
No, because you can't have line of sight to it. So you walk into the room and you say, I'm going to cast Find Traps. And the DM says, yes, there are traps. They might burn you. The end. Good luck.
That's all you get. And it only has a 120-foot range. So I feel like this spell just confirms your paranoia?
Yeah, it's the equivalent of looking on the internet for your symptoms when you're sick and realizing, oh man, I'm probably going to die.
That's pretty much it.
You walk into a room, you're like, oh, I'm really worried that there's traps in here. There are. Oh no.
And unbelievably, this spell isn't even a ritual. It requires your 2nd level spell slot to cast. This spell helps you find a trap, and the trap is the spell because you took it.
We're being ambushed. What do you think, Admiral Akbar? It's a trap. Thanks. We got that. We figured that one out. The better name for this spell would be theoretically allude to traps.
Okay, so what is a better alternative? Well, first of all, I think that good play is a good substitute for this spell. But if you really want a divination spell that's going to help you potentially, I would even try something like Augury, which is a second level ritual spell that is still available to clerics that will at least tell you, is it going to bring me weal or woe to walk down this hallway?
Honestly, if you walk into the room and say, I'd like to just check the floorboards to see if there's traps here, you probably have a better chance of finding useful information than casting Find Traps.
Better yet, send the wizard's familiar. Or just send the barbarian.
The fourth spell that we're looking at today is one that I really want to like, but can't. Crown of Madness.
This is a spell that will break your heart because it reads really potently until you realize all the problems that it has. In fact, no one in our community poll mentioned this spell at all, and it's terrible, and it's almost as much of a trap as Find Traps and Witch Bolt. Here's why. It's a second level enchantment spell available to bards, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards. You can find it on page 229 of your player's handbook.
So when you cast this spell, one humanoid that you choose must make a wisdom saving throw or be charmed by you for the duration.
A cool crown of thorns appears around its head, and while it's charmed by you in this way, at the start of its turns before moving, you can mentally choose one target that your charmed victim must attack. If you don't choose a target, and you can't choose the target itself, it gets to act normally, and it still gets to move normally on its turns as well. On subsequent turns, you can continue to control the target in this way, but you have to spend your action to do so, or the spell immediately ends. And at the end of each of the target's turns, it also gets to shake out of the spell by making a wisdom saving throw.
So, when I first read this spell, what I thought it read was, oh, I get to put a cool crown on an enemy and they'll attack their allies. But really, there's a lot of fine print in there that makes it seem like this might be pretty useless. The target that they're going to attack needs to be within their range before they make their movement. You don't get to move them. If there's nobody within their range, they're not going to do anything. They can move normally, meaning that they can move away from their allies, therefore negating your ability to use this spell in any real way.
It only affects a humanoid foe, and it only forces them to make melee attacks. So it does have a very limited range. It would be way more useful if you could make them make a ranged attack, but you can't. In addition to this, if you choose no target at all, because the only target beside your foe is one of your allies, and you don't want to give them an attack against your allies, do you? Then they just get to act normally.
So this spell has a very small chance of actually succeeding in doing anything useful.
Yeah, potentially the first turn that you cast it, when there already is two of your enemies right beside each other, you'll get to control them to make one attack. And that's it. But a big problem that the spell suffers from is that it only affects humanoid enemies, and it causes a charm effect, which means elves have advantage on saving throws, and you're not going to be able to use this against higher level foes like giants and dragons and demons that actually have really, really scary melee attacks. It's only humanoids who generally don't have high damage dealing melee attacks. They usually rely on multi-attack to make several attacks to get their damage high. This is a really disappointing spell.
The final spell that we're going to look at today is Mordenkainen's Sword.
Mordenkainen's Sword is a 7th level evocation spell available to bards and wizards, and you can find it on page 262 of your player's handbook.
When you cast Mordenkainen's Sword using your 7th level spell slot, a magical sword appears, and as a bonus action, you can have it attack somebody, causing 3d10 damage.
When the sword first appears, you get to make an attack with it. And since you can then attack with a bonus action using it, the first turn of it is actually not too bad. You get to make 2 attacks with it. But on subsequent turns, it can only make an attack using your bonus action. It does 3d10 force damage, and you can move it 20 feet on subsequent turns. This is starting to sound a lot like Spiritual Weapon.
But Spiritual Weapon is a much lower level spell.
A second level spell, in fact, and one that doesn't require concentration. It's only available to clerics, but the comparison is very stark. For 5 levels worth of spells higher, and your concentration, you're dealing 3d10 force damage instead of 1d8 plus your wisdom mod? That's awful, especially considering all the amazing things that you can do with your 7th level spell slot. I am very hard-pressed to think of a circumstance where a character with access to 7th level spells, like a 13th level wizard, is so desperate to get a source of force damage that they would use their 7th level spell slot to cast this spell.
This spell is almost good if you read it, until you notice the 7th level spell slot. That's the real reason why it's making this list.
If this spell was several levels lower and didn't require concentration, like Spiritual Weapon, it would be amazing. But because of the spell slot requirement and the concentration requirement, it really is a trap of a spell to cast. Which is a shame, because conjuring a spectral sword to attack your foes is a really cool fantasy. But so is conjuring a magical box of force that traps your foes indefinitely for up to an hour.
Or a giant wall of fire for a much lower level.
That does as much or more damage. Or teleporting to another plane of existence. It just is completely outclassed by the other options at this level. It is the worst 7th level spell in the game, I think. And just one that you should absolutely avoid.
I'd say it's even upsetting compared to several of the spells at a few lower levels.
Absolutely. So, to wrap up, we did poll the community for your ideas on what some of the other bad spells in the game are. They didn't quite make our top 5, but they certainly are close contenders. And to be perfectly honest, we would love to talk about all of these in more detail, but we're going to leave you just with some of our honorable mentions to close out our episode.
Honorable mentions include Blade Ward,
Ray of Enfeeblement,
Flame Blade,
Blight,
Confusion,
Grasping Vine,
Phantasmal Killer,
Tensor's Transformation,
the various Investor of Fire, Ice, etc. spells,
as well as the 9th level spell Weird, which was in close contention with Mordenkainen's sword for being the worst high-level spell. Many of these spells that we mentioned are bad for the same reason as the spells in our top 5. They usually require concentration, require your action on subsequent turns to maintain, or like Crown of Madness, they sound really good, but the chances of the effect actually being pulled off in the way that you imagine it to are pretty low. And so you should consider other options that are more reliable and dependable instead of them.
So the question for you is, are these spells beyond redemption, or are there good uses of them out there?
But in answering that question, you really need to look at other spells of the same level and consider how those spells might offer more flexibility. Again, it's easy to make the argument that every spell has a place in the game, but unfortunately, spellcasters only get to prepare or know a limited number of spells. So even though a spell might have a situational use, it's competing with other spells for your spell slots, your spells known, and your action in battle or your time during the adventure. If a spell is still useful despite all those facts, we would love to know if you think that it is.
Or if there's any other spells that you think are complete stinkers, we'd like to hear about those as well. So this has been our look at our top 5 worst spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We hope that you never take them.
You can catch Kelly and I playing Dungeons & Dragons live in our campaign, Dungeons of Drakkenheim.
It airs every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/dungeon_dudes. If you want some good spell recommendations for the class you're picking, you can check out our class guides right up over here.
And we've got a whole series explaining the rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that you can find right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.